in the San Carlos country of the Arizona Territory, in the autumn of 1885, a man of 32 named Wyatt Calder found a foal missing from his corral on the 11th of September and did not go looking for whoever had taken it. That alone made him unusual in that country in that year. He ran a small outfit on leased range along the San Pedro. 800 head and a line shack and a house he had built himself out of adobe brick, and he shared a boundary of 9 miles with land the government called a reservation, and the people who lived on it called home, which was the Chiricahua and Cheyenne bands living, in that uneasy year, under watch and under ration and under a peace that nobody on either side of the fence entirely believed in. A foal gone missing in September of 1885 in that country, in that year, was the kind of thing that got men killed. It was the kind of thing that got a posse raised inside of a day, that got a band accused inside of 2, that turned a missing colt into a border incident before anybody had asked a single honest question. Wyatt Calder did not raise a posse. He rode the fence line himself for 2 days alone, and on the second day he found the tracks of the foal crossing onto reservation land through a gap in his own fence where a post had rotted through, following a dry wash that any yearling would have followed on its own, without a single set of human tracks anywhere near it. The foal had wandered off. Nobody had taken it. He crossed onto the reservation anyway, which a white rancher did not do without an escort and without permission, and he found the foal on the 3rd day grazing in a meadow 2 miles in, and he found it because a young man watching a horse herd for the band had already caught it up and haltered it and was holding it, waiting. Having seen the Calder brand and having no way to get word across the line without crossing it himself, which he was not willing to risk any more than Calder was, the young man's name was Naish Yellow Horse, and he was 19, and he did not speak much English, and Wyatt Calder did not speak much of anything else, and the 2 of them stood in that meadow for the better part of an hour working out, in gestures and in the dozen Apache words Calder had picked up doing business at the agency store. That the horse was his, and that nobody had stolen anything, and that they were both, in fact, relieved to have the matter over with before it became something neither of them could control. Calder took the halter rope. He said thank you in the only way he knew how, which was to take the good clasp knife off his belt, the one with the staghorn handle, and hold it out. Naish Yellow Horse did not take it at first. Then he did, and he nodded once, and that was the whole of the transaction, and Wyatt Calder rode home leading his foal and thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Word of what had happened moved through the reservation the way word moves through a small watched population with very little else to talk about, and it moved through the ranches along the San Pedro the same way, and by the following week it had become, on both sides of the fence, a story about a white rancher who had ridden onto Apache land unarmed and unescorted to return a horse nobody had stolen rather than raise trouble over a rumour. On both sides of that fence in the autumn of 1885. That was a genuinely strange thing for a man to have done. Cochise's people had been at San Carlos on and off in various configurations of trust and betrayal, for going on a decade by then, herded there after Cochise's own death in 1874 had taken with it the last agreement anybody entirely believed in. The band on the land bordering Calder's range was led by a man named Delshay Nantan, who had been a young war leader in the Sibicu troubles the year before, and who had buried more of his own people to disease and to army rifles than Wyatt Calder in his whole life had buried cattle. Delshay Nantan did not trust white ranchers. He had specific and well-earned reasons not to. He had watched 3 separate agents at San Carlos promise things that were not delivered, had watched rations cut without warning, had watched his own authority over his own people undermined by men in Washington who had never once set foot in the territory they were legislating. But he had also, in 31 years of leading people through a country that kept trying to erase them, developed a very precise eye for the difference between a man who was performing decency for an audience and a man who did a decent thing, because there was nobody there to see him not do it. Wyatt Calder had ridden 2 miles onto reservation land, alone, unarmed but for the knife he gave away, to return a horse that nobody but a rotten fence post had taken. There had been no agent watching. There had been no posse to impress. There had been a 19-year-old boy holding a rope and a rancher who decided the truth was worth more trouble to find than a lie was worth to assume. Delshay Nantan thought about that for 6 weeks. On the morning of the 23rd of October 1885, Wyatt Calder heard hooves before sunrise and came out of his house with a rifle. Because a man in that country, in that year, heard hooves before sunrise and expected trouble, and trouble had a way of arriving exactly when a man had let his guard down enough to feel foolish for keeping it up. What he found at his own fence line, in the grey light before the sun came over the Galiuros, was Delshay Nantan himself, on a good grey horse, with 4 riders behind him at a respectful distance, and beside him, on a horse of her own, a young woman Calder had never seen before. He set the rifle down against the fence post, which was the only sensible thing to do, and which he did slowly, so that everyone present could watch him do it. Delshay Nantan spoke first, through Naish Yellow Horse, who had come along as the only one present besides the woman with enough English to carry the meaning across. He says, Naish translated, that a man who returns a horse nobody stole, and does it without a witness, is a man whose word can be trusted further than most men's oaths. He says this is a rare thing on either side of this fence. Tell him I am obliged, but I do not need thanking for doing what anybody decent would have done. Naish translated that. Delshay Nantan's expression did not change, but something in his posture did. A settling, as though the answer had confirmed something he had already suspected. He says that is exactly why he is here, said Naish. Because you said what you just said, and meant it, instead of saying it to be agreeable. Then Delshay Nantan gestured, and the young woman rode forward, alone, to the fence line, and stopped her horse there and looked at Wyatt Calder directly, which was itself a thing he had not expected, because he had spent enough time near the agency to have absorbed a general sense that a woman of standing among these people did not typically ride forward to look a strange man in the eye. Her name, Naish said, was Clonius, which meant something like morning star, and Calder understood, with a mixture of confusion and alarm that he did his level best not to show on his face, that Delshay Nantan appeared to be presenting her to him. He understood it wrong, and it took him the better part of the conversation that followed to be corrected. And the narrator would like to be plain about the correction, because it matters. Tell him, Calder said carefully to Naish, that I am grateful for whatever kindness is meant here, but I am not in a position to accept a gift of a person. Nobody is a gift. I would not know what to do with a wife I had not asked for and who had not asked for me, and I would think less of myself for taking one. Naish translated this, and there was a long pause, and then, to Calder's considerable surprise, it was Delshay Nantan who laughed. A short, dry sound, and it was the young woman herself who answered, and she answered in English, which nobody had told him she spoke. He did not bring me here to give me to you, Clonius said. He brought me here because I asked to come, and because he trusts my judgment more than he trusts his own about which white men are worth watching and which are worth avoiding. I have been to the mission school at San Carlos for 4 years, I read and write in English better than half the agents who have been sent to manage us. My father did not choose this meeting on my behalf. I asked for it. Wyatt Calder stood at his own fence line and felt, for the first time in the whole encounter, thoroughly out of his depth. I owe you an apology, then, for assuming otherwise. You do, Clonius agreed, without softening it. But it is an honest mistake for a man raised in this territory to make, and I did not ride 2 miles before dawn to be offended by it. I rode here because I wanted to see for myself the man my father has spent 6 weeks talking about, and because I am the one on this reservation who keeps the accounts of what is promised to us and what is delivered. And because I think you might be useful to that work if you are half of what you appear to be. If you have come this far with these people, stay a little longer, because what happens next is what decided everything. And if stories of courage crossing borders that were never meant to be crossed move you, the bell beneath this story is how we keep meeting like this. What Clonius meant by useful became clear over the following 2 months, and it was not romantic in nature, not at first, and the narrator wants that stated without embarrassment. Because what grew between Wyatt Calder and Clonius in the autumn and winter of 1885 grew out of something sturdier than an arranged glance across a fence line. And it is worth letting it grow the way it actually grew. The ration allotments at San Carlos were, in the autumn of 1885, being systematically shorted by a contractor named Silas Enoch Purdy, who held the beef contract for the agency, and who had worked out, over 3 years, a scheme so ordinary in that era that it barely qualified as clever. He delivered cattle for weighing that had been driven hard and watered heavily beforehand, inflating their weight on paper, then delivered the actual beef thinner and lighter than the manifest claimed, pocketing the difference between what the government paid for and what the people actually received. It was a crime committed entirely on paper, and paper was exactly the ground on which Clonius operated best. She had been keeping her own count for 2 years, a private tally of every delivery, cross-checked against what her own people reported receiving, written in a ledger she kept hidden because an agency clerk had once confiscated a similar record from another woman and burned it in front of the whole encampment as a lesson about who was permitted to keep books. What she needed, and what she told Wyatt Calder plainly on the second occasion they spoke, was a white witness. A rancher's testimony about cattle weights carried weight with an inspector in a way that an Apache woman's ledger, however meticulous, simply did not, in the calculus of that decade, and she was not interested in pretending otherwise or being precious about the unfairness of it. She needed the tool that was in front of her, and Wyatt Calder was the tool. "I do not mind being used for that," he told her, the first time she laid it out for him, sitting his horse at the fence line in the cold air of early November while she sat hers on the other side. "I would rather be used for something honest than admired for nothing." "That is a good answer," Clonius said. "Most men want to be thanked more than they want to be useful. You will find I have very little patience left for the first kind." He began riding to the agency weighing station whenever Purdy's deliveries came through, ostensibly on ranch business, actually to watch, and to count and to compare his own rough tally against what went on to the official manifest. It took 11 weeks. It required him to make himself unpopular with a contractor who had friends among the very agents meant to oversee him. And it required Clonius to keep her ledger current under conditions that made the keeping of it dangerous. And it required both of them to trust the other with information that could have gotten either of them hurt if it had reached the wrong ears too soon. They talked, in those 11 weeks, at the fence, in the cold, about things that had nothing to do with cattle weights. He told her about his mother, dead of fever in Missouri when he was 9, and about the uncle who had raised him with more discipline than warmth, and had taught him that a man's word was the only currency that could not be counterfeited. She told him about the Sibicu fight, which she had survived as a girl of 14, and about watching her own uncle die of measles at San Carlos 2 years after surviving 3 army campaigns, and about the specific, grinding exhaustion of being the person in a community who is expected to be reasonable, to keep records, to trust process. While process failed her people in ways large and small every single week. You could hate every white man in this territory, and no reasonable person would blame you for it, Calder said to her once, in December, watching his breath fog in the cold. I have thought about that arithmetic, Clonius said. It does not balance. Hating every man for what some men did leaves no room to notice the ones who do not deserve it, and I have decided I would rather stay sharp-eyed than go blind with anger. Anger is easier. I am not interested in easier. It was in December, on a morning when the frost had silvered the whole valley, and neither of them had said much of anything for a while, that Wyatt Calder understood he had stopped riding to that fence line for the sake of the investigation, and had started riding there for the sake of the hour itself, and that the woman on the other side of the wire had become the reason his week made sense. He did not say so, neither did she. But something in how long they let the silences run, comfortable rather than awkward, told them both what neither was prepared yet to name. There was a morning in the middle of December when the cold nearly undid the whole careful architecture they had built between them. She had ridden out before the frost had fully lifted, and her horse had thrown a shoe 1/2 mile from the fence, and she had walked the rest of the way leading it, and by the time she reached him her hands had gone stiff and pale at the knuckles, and she was trying, without success, to work the girth strap loose to check the animal's foot. He came through the gap in the fence without thinking about whether that crossing was permitted that morning, which it was not, strictly, and took her hands in his to warm them before he did anything else. Before he looked at the horse at all, and neither of them commented on it, and neither of them let go for longer than the warming required. Your hands are like creek ice, he said. They will thaw. They have thawed every winter of my life. Let me look at the shoe first, then, and we will see about the rest of you after. He crouched at the horse's foot, and she stood over him with her hand resting. Absently, on his shoulder for balance against the uneven ground, and the weight of it stayed there a good deal longer than the balance required. And both of them understood it, and neither of them moved to end it. And it was the cold, and not either of their wills, that finally sent them both back to their separate sides of the wire. Neither of them spoke of it afterward, but Wyatt Calder found, riding home that morning, that his hand still carried the shape of hers in it, the way a glove holds a shape after the hand has left it. And he understood that whatever this was becoming had already become something neither the ledger nor the fence line could account for. The inspector came from Washington in February of 1886. A career man named Halloran, who had seen enough agency graft in 15 years to be sceptical of everything and impressed by nothing, and he was prepared to be sceptical of an Apache woman's ledger and dismissive of it in the ordinary course of business. What he was not prepared for was a white rancher's independent tally, kept over 11 weeks, in a separate hand, in separate ink, matching hers delivery for delivery, discrepancy for discrepancy, down to the pound. It did not go uncontested, and it nearly went a great deal worse than a lost contract. Purdy had, by January, worked out that someone was tallying his deliveries against him, and he had the sense to worry about it, and not quite the sense to leave well enough alone. 2 men in his employ, drovers he paid in cash and loyalty rather than in anything written down, rode onto Calder's range on a night in late January when there was no moon to speak of, and they did not come to talk. Wyatt Calder woke to the sound of his own corral gate being forced and came out into the yard with a rifle for the second time that winter, and this time there was in fact trouble waiting for him. 2 riders with their faces covered, who had come to burn the tally book they rightly guessed he kept in the house, and who were not particular about whether the house burned along with it. He put a shot across the nearer man's shoulder before either of them got a hand on the door, close enough to convince and far enough to spare, which was a harder thing to manage in the dark than it sounds, and both riders went back over the fence and did not return, and Calder spent the rest of that night sitting up with the rifle across his knees, watching the tree line, understanding for the first time in his life exactly what it might cost him to keep doing the thing he had decided to keep doing. Clonius heard of it before dawn, the way news travelled along that reservation faster than any telegraph line the government had bothered to string to it, and she was at his fence before the sun was fully up, without her father's escort, alone. Which she had never once done before. You could have been killed. I was not. That is not an answer to what I said. He looked at her across the wire in the grey early light, and he understood that she was not asking him to stop, because she of all people knew exactly what the alternative to this fight looked like, but that she needed, for her own reasons, to hear him say plainly that he understood the weight of what continuing would cost. I know what it might cost, he said. I have known since November. I am not going to pretend to you that I only just worked it out, sitting up last night with a rifle. I knew what I was riding into the first time I rode to that weighing station, and I decided it was worth it then. And last night did not change the arithmetic, it only made it real. He held her gaze. I would ask the same honesty of you. You have been keeping that ledger 2 years under conditions worse than one bad night. I am not the only one taking a risk here, and I would not have you pretend otherwise for my comfort. Clonius was quiet a long moment, her breath fogging in the cold between them. No, she said, I would not pretend that. I have never once pretended that, to myself or to anyone. Something in her face eased, very slightly. I only needed to hear you say it plainly. Men do not always say things plainly. I have found I do not trust the ones who will not. Silas Enoch Purdy lost his contract in March of 1886. He was not prosecuted, because prosecution of agency contractors was, in that era, a rare and difficult thing even with evidence this clean, but he was barred from federal contracts in the territory for the remainder of his life, and the beef allotments at San Carlos increased within the month under a new contractor who had no interest in repeating a scheme that had just cost a predecessor. Everything. It was not justice in the complete sense. The narrator will not pretend otherwise. 2 years of shorted rations were not restored, and the people who had gone hungry in those 2 years did not get those months back. But it was the truth, established and acted on, and Clonius had spent enough of her life watching the truth be ignored to know exactly what it was worth when it was not. Delshe Nantan called Wyatt Calder to him in March, and this time there was no ceremony to it, only the 2 of them and Naish translating, sitting on the ground outside the older man's dwelling. He says, Naish translated, that he watched you for 6 months before he trusted you with anything that mattered, and that he was right to wait, and that he was right before that. To bring his daughter to your fence, though he wants it clearly understood that he did not bring her as a gift, and never once considered doing so, and finds it faintly insulting that you assumed he might. Tell him I understood my mistake at the time and I still regret making it. He says he knows that. He says the fact that you regretted it and said so rather than growing defensive about it, was the second thing that told him what kind of man you were. Naish paused to let Delshe Nantan finish. He says the first thing was the horse. Wyatt Calder asked Delshe Nantan's permission before he asked Clonius anything at all, which he understood, by that point, to be the correct order of things, and he asked it plainly, without ceremony, sitting again on the ground outside the older man's dwelling with Naish translating. He says Naish reported, after a long exchange Calder could not follow, that he is not in the habit of granting permission for his daughter's choices, because she has never once required it, and did not require it now. He says if you had asked him instead of asking her, he would have sent you home to think about why you made that mistake. Naish allowed himself the ghost of a smile. He says you should go and ask the person who actually has to say yes. Calder found her at the creek that afternoon, checking a fish trap she had set the day before, and he did not make a speech of it, because by then they had spent a year learning that neither of them trusted speeches over plain statements. I am not going to pretend I know how to do this the way your people do it, or the way mine does either, if it comes to that, he said. I only know that I have ridden to that fence line every week for a year, for reasons that stopped being about cattle weights sometime around December, and I expect you knew that before I did. I knew it in November, said Clonius, not looking up from the trap. Then I am asking you plainly. Not your father. You, she looked up at him then, and the creek ran on behind her, and she said, yes, with no more ceremony than he had used to ask it, and that was the whole of it, and it was, both of them agreed for the rest of their lives, exactly enough. They were married in the autumn of 1886, a year almost to the week after a foal wandered through a rotten fence post, and the ceremony was held twice, once at the mission in the manner the agency required for the marriage to be recognised under territorial law, and once among her own people in the manner that mattered to her father, with the whole encampment turning out for it. A Naish yellow horse standing beside Calder at both, having appointed himself, without being asked, the man who would make certain nothing was lost in translation on the one day it mattered most. At the mission ceremony, conducted by a circuit priest who plainly disapproved and performed the rite anyway because the law required him to, and his conscience, to his credit, would not let him refuse it, there were perhaps a dozen witnesses, mostly ranchers who had come out of curiosity and stayed out of something that looked, by the end, like respect. At the ceremony among her own people, held 2 days later beside the same creek where he had asked her, there were near 200, and there was singing that went on long past dark. And Delshe Nantan spoke at length in a language Calder still could not follow, and Naish translated only the last of it for him afterward, walking him back toward his horse under a sky thick with stars. He said that a fence is not a wall unless the men on both sides decide to make it one, Naish said. He said you decided otherwise on a morning in September, before any of us knew what it would cost you or what it would become. He said that is the only kind of man worth giving a daughter to, and the only kind he would have chosen even if she had not chosen you first. Wyatt Calder stood through both ceremonies and understood that he was being asked to belong to two things at once, and that this was not a burden but an honour he intended to spend the rest of his life earning. They lived on the San Pedro range for 31 years. Clonius kept her ledgers the whole of that time, expanding her accounting far beyond San Carlos, becoming, by the turn of the century, a woman whose records were quietly trusted by inspectors across 2 territories precisely because she had never once been caught inflating a grievance or softening a fact to suit a friend. Wyatt Calder ran cattle and mended fences, and never once, in 31 years, let a rotten post go unrepaired, which the neighbours thought was an eccentricity, and which he never explained to a single one of them. The staghorn knife came back to him in a strange way. Naish Yellow Horse, grown into a man of considerable standing among his own people by the 1890s, returned it to Calder on the occasion of his and Clonius's 10th anniversary, explaining that he had carried it all those years as a reminder that a debt paid in good faith was worth more than the object itself, and that he judged the debt. At last, fully settled, and wanted his friend to have back the thing he had given away so easily on a morning in September when neither of them had known yet what that gesture would become. Wyatt Calder kept it the rest of his life. It hung, eventually, on a nail by his own door, not the door of the house he had built alone in 1885, but the door of the house he and Clonius built together in 1888. Larger, with a room added for the children who came, 3 of them, raised to speak both languages and to keep both kinds of accounts, the kind written in ink and the kind carried in memory. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived quiet and crossed a border that was never meant to be crossed, then this story was for you. Along the San Pedro, where the fence line still runs and the wash still carries a colt's tracks after rain, the love between Wyatt Calder and Clonius became the kind that does not need anybody to remember it to be real, though that country remembered it anyway, in the accounts she kept and the fences he never let fall to rot again. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, prejudice, and the kind of silence only the West knows speak to you, follow the lonesome trail for more. Here, the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.